The gravel crunched under my worn Converse as I stepped out of Danny's beat-up Honda, stretching arms that had been cramped against the passenger door for 3 hours. The lake house sat before us like something from a postcard, weathered cedar shingles, a wraparound porch dotted with Adirondack chairs, and beyond it all, the mirror-still surface of Lake Clearwater reflecting the late afternoon sun. God, I forgot how quiet it is here, I murmured, shouldering my duffel bag. The silence was so complete it felt like a weight settling over my shoulders, pushing out the constant hum of city traffic and campus noise that had been my soundtrack for months. Danny was already bounding up the porch steps, keys jingling. Wait until you see the sunset from the dock. It's insane. He paused at the front door, glancing back at me with that grin that had gotten us both into trouble since middle school. And the best part? No cell service. Mom made Dad promise not to install a booster. I should have felt relieved. Finals had nearly killed me. Endless nights in the library, coffee-stained notes, the crushing weight of expectations. This weekend was supposed to be my reset button. Just me, my best friend since 7th grade, and 3 days of absolutely nothing. The screen door creaked as we stepped inside, and immediately I was hit with that distinctive lake house smell. Pine, old wood, and something faintly musty that spoke of summers and memories layered like dust on forgotten shelves. The living room was exactly as I remembered from the handful of times I'd visited. Mismatched furniture that somehow worked perfectly together, a stone fireplace dominating one wall and windows everywhere, all of them framing different angles of the lake. Mom left us a whole lasagna, Danny called from the kitchen. And there's beer in the... Danny? The voice came from the back of the house, low and unfamiliar. Danny froze, a package of ground coffee halfway to the counter. Shit, he muttered. I forgot. Forgot what? Heavy footsteps on hardwood, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway, tall, broader than I remembered, wearing a faded Marine Corps t-shirt that clung to shoulders I definitely didn't remember being that defined. His dark hair was shorter than it had been in the few photos I'd seen over the years, and there was something different about his face. Sharper, maybe, more guarded. Marcus, Danny's older brother. Hey, he said, nodding at Danny, then turning those dark eyes to me. Ethan, right? I managed to nod, suddenly very aware of how I must look, rumpled from the drive, my hair doing that thing where it stuck up in the back, probably smelling like the gas station energy drinks that had fueled our road trip. Marcus, on the other hand, looked like he'd stepped out of some catalog for people who actually had their lives together. I thought you were staying at Sarah's place, Danny said, and there was something tight in his voice I didn't recognize. Marcus shrugged, leaning against the doorframe with an ease that made me want to find somewhere to put my hands. Plans changed. Hope you don't mind the company. Of course not. It's your house, too. Danny ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I'd seen 1,000 times. I should have called. Should have called Mom, not me. She's the one who told me you'd be here. Marcus's gaze flicked back to me, lingering for just a moment longer than felt casual. How long has it been? 4 years? 5, I said, then immediately wished I hadn't been so quick with the answer. It made me sound like I'd been counting, which, if I was being honest with myself, I had been. The last time I'd seen Marcus Chen Williams was at Danny's high school graduation. I'd been a senior then, 17 and awkward in a way that felt like it might be permanent. Marcus had been 22, fresh out of his first deployment, wearing his dress blues and looking like he belonged in a different world entirely. I'd spent most of that day trying not to stare at him across the graduation ceremony, fascinated by this person who shared Danny's easy smile but carried himself like he was made of something denser, more substantial. Now he was here in this kitchen that suddenly felt too small, and I was 22 myself, supposedly an adult with a college degree that was supposed to mean something. But standing there in his presence, I felt like that 17-year-old again, tongue-tied and hyper-aware of every inch of space between us. Well, Marcus said, pushing off from the doorframe, I'll stay out of your way, just here to do some work on the boat motor anyway. The sunfish? Danny perked up. What's wrong with it? Same thing that's been wrong with it for 3 years. Dad keeps saying he'll fix it, but... Marcus shrugged again, and I found myself watching the way the gesture moved his shoulders. Figured I'd give it a shot. Ethan's good with engines, Danny said suddenly, and I felt heat creep up my neck. I'm really not. He fixed my bike freshman year when that asshole Jake Henderson put sugar in the gas tank. That was just a carburetor cleaning, I protested, but Marcus was looking at me with something that might have been interest. You mind giving me a hand tomorrow? Could use someone who actually knows what they're doing. I should have said I didn't know what I was doing, that Danny was overselling my very limited mechanical skills. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Sure." "Great." He grabbed a beer from the fridge, twisted off the cap with his bare hands in a move that was probably unconscious but made something flutter low in my stomach. To anyone, he just holes up at his apartment in town. Mom's been worried. It's fine, I said, and meant it. More than meant it, actually, though I wasn't ready to examine why. He won't bother us. Marcus has always been kind of a loner, even before he enlisted. We can just do our own thing. I nodded, but as I watched Danny move around the kitchen, pulling out plates and talking about our plans for the weekend, I found my attention drifting to the window that faced the lake. I could see Marcus down at the dock, crouched next to a small sailboat that had been pulled up onto the shore. Even from this distance, I could tell he was completely absorbed in whatever he was doing, his dark head bent over the motor housing. There was something about the picture he made, solitary, focused, framed by water and sky, that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't quite understand. You still with me? Danny was looking at me with raised eyebrows. Yeah, sorry, just tired from the drive. But as we carried our bags upstairs to the room we'd be sharing, twin beds separated by a nightstand exactly like every childhood sleepover, I couldn't shake the image of Marcus by the water. There had been something different about him, something that went beyond the obvious changes that 5 years in military service would bring. He'd looked at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle, like I was something worth figuring out. I told myself I was imagining it. The sun was setting by the time Danny and I made it down to the lake, our bellies full of reheated lasagna and our hands wrapped around bottles of his mom's leftover craft beer. The dock stretched out into waters so still it looked like black glass, and at the end of it, two Adirondack chairs sat waiting. This is perfect, I said, settling into one of the chairs and letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. I forgot what actual quiet sounds like. Danny grinned, kicking his feet up on the dock railing. Right? No sirens, no construction, no asshole neighbors playing music at 2 a.m. He took a long pull from his beer. I love the city, but sometimes you need to remember you're human. Exactly. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the tree line on the far shore. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called, that haunting sound that seemed to echo off the water and settle into your bones. I felt my shoulders finally start to unknot, the constant tension I'd been carrying for weeks slowly seeping away. So, Danny said after a while, his voice carefully casual. What did you think of Marcus? I kept my eyes on the water. What do you mean? I don't know. I guess I was expecting him to be more like he was before he left. Joking around, giving me shit. Danny was quiet for a moment. He's been different since he got back, quieter. Mom says he doesn't really talk about what happened over there. I'd been wondering the same thing. The Marcus I remembered from high school had been confident, sure, but there had been a lightness to him, too. He'd been the kind of older brother who would ruffle Danny's hair and steal food off his plate, who would acknowledge me with an easy nod when I came over to hang out. This Marcus felt heavier somehow, like he was carrying weight the rest of us couldn't see. Maybe he just needs time, I said. Yeah, maybe. Danny was quiet for another moment. It's weird having him here. I mean, not weird, just I don't know how to act around him anymore. Like, do I treat him the same as before? Do I ask about the military stuff? Do I pretend nothing's changed? I understood what he meant, but for different reasons I wasn't ready to articulate. Just be yourself. He's still your brother. I guess. Danny drained his beer and stood, stretching. I'm gonna grab another one. You want? I shook my head, still nursing my first. Danny disappeared back toward the house, leaving me alone with the growing darkness and the gentle lap of water against the dock posts. That's when I heard it, the soft scrape of footsteps on wood behind me. Mind if I join you? I turned to find Marcus standing at the head of the dock, silhouetted against the porch lights. He had a beer in one hand and something that looked like a manual in the other. Of course, I said, though my heart suddenly decided to pick up its pace. He settled into Danny's vacated chair, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and understated that made me want to lean closer. We sat in silence for a while, both of us looking out at the water. The darkness was complete now, the lake a black mirror reflecting the first stars. Boat manual? I asked, nodding at the booklet in his hands. Outboard motor repair guide. He held it up with a wry smile. Riveting bedtime reading. Find anything useful? Maybe. Hard to tell without actually getting my hands dirty. He took a sip of his beer and I watched his throat work as he swallowed. You sure you don't mind helping tomorrow? I know Danny volunteered you without asking. I don't mind, I said, and found that I meant it more than I should have. I like working with my hands. The words came out sounding different than I'd intended, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. But if Marcus noticed, he didn't show it. Good, he said simply. We lapsed back into silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something peaceful about sitting here with him, watching the water and listening to the soft sounds of the lake at night. I found myself stealing glances at his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the careful way he held himself even in relaxation. It's beautiful out here, I said finally, needing to fill the quiet before it became obvious I was staring. Yeah. His voice was soft, thoughtful. I'd forgotten. How long were you deployed? 2 tours, 18 months total. He was quiet for a moment. Longest I'd ever been away from home. Must have been hard. He made a non-committal sound. You get used to it. The hard part is coming back. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone warned me off. Instead, I said, Danny's worried about you. Marcus turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. Danny worries about everyone. It's his nature. He cares about you. I know. Marcus's voice was quiet. Sometimes that makes it harder. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. We sat there in the dark, the silence stretching between us like a held breath. I was acutely aware of how close he was, of the way his presence seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the night. "Where's Danny?" he asked suddenly. I glanced back toward the house, surprised to realize how long my best friend had been gone. Getting another beer, I think. Maybe he got distracted by something. Probably fell asleep on the couch. He always did that when we were kids, said he was just resting his eyes for a minute, then we'd find him there in the morning. The fondness in his voice when he talked about Danny made something warm unfurl in my chest. It was clear he loved his little brother, even if he didn't know how to show it anymore. "You must have missed him," I said, "while you were away." Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I missed a lot of things." Something in the way he said it made me look at him again. He was staring out at the water, his expression unreadable in the darkness, but there was something in his posture, a tension, a careful control that made me think he was holding back more than he was saying. "Like what?" I asked softly. He turned those dark eyes on me again, and for a moment I felt like he could see straight through me, like he was looking for something I didn't even know I was hiding. "The quiet," he said finally. "The way the air smells here. The sound of water at night." A pause. "People who don't expect you to be someone you're not." The last part felt significant somehow, weighted with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I wanted to ask him who he was expected to be, who he really was underneath all that careful control. But before I could work up the courage, the screen door slammed and Danny's voice cut through the night. "Sorry, got caught up in a phone call with Mom. She wanted to make sure you guys weren't burning the place down." He bounded down the dock toward us, fresh beer in hand. "What did I miss?" "Just talking about tomorrow," Marcus said smoothly, like we hadn't been sharing something that felt almost intimate in its honesty. "Right, the boat motor." Danny settled back into the chair on my other side. "Ethan's being modest about his mechanical skills, by the way. He rebuilt the engine in his first car from scratch." "Danny, it's true. That old Toyota was basically scrap metal when he bought it, and by the time he was done with it, it purring like a kitten." I could feel Marcus looking at me again, and I stared determinedly at the water. "It was just a weekend project. A 3-month weekend project. The point is, it worked." "See?" Danny grinned. "Told you he was good with engines." Marcus made a thoughtful sound. "Good to know." We talked for another hour after that, about college, about Danny's internship prospects, about the changes that had come to the lake since Marcus had been away. But underneath the easy conversation, I was hyper-aware of every movement Marcus made, every time his laugh rumbled low in his chest, every moment when his attention settled on me. When we finally headed back to the house, I lingered on the dock for a moment, ostensibly to finish my beer, but really just to watch Marcus walk away. There was something about the way he moved, controlled, purposeful, like every step was deliberate, that made it hard to look away. "You coming?" Danny called from the porch. "Yeah," I said, but I stayed where I was for another moment, looking out at the dark water and trying to make sense of the restless energy that had settled under my skin. Upstairs, as Danny and I got ready for bed, I found myself thinking about the conversation by the water. There had been layers to it I didn't understand, currents beneath the surface that I'd felt but couldn't name, and the way Marcus had looked at me. "You okay?" Danny asked. He was already in his pajamas, that old Michigan State t-shirt he'd had since freshman year. "Yeah, just tired." But as I lay in the narrow twin bed, listening to Danny's breathing even out beside me and the soft sounds of the house settling around us, I found myself wide awake. Somewhere down the hall, Marcus was sleeping, and the knowledge of his presence seemed to fill the entire space between my skin and the sheets. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings, the change from city noise to lake quiet. But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to name. I woke to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen below, the soft clink of dishes and the whisper of footsteps on hardwood. According to my phone, it was barely past 7, and Danny was still dead to the world in the bed next to mine, one arm flung over his eyes to block out the morning light streaming through the windows. I pulled on yesterday's jeans and a clean t-shirt as quietly as I could and padded downstairs barefoot. The morning air was cool against my skin, carrying the scent of pine and lake water through the open windows. Marcus was standing at the kitchen counter with his back to me, pouring coffee from a French press into 2 ceramic mugs. He was wearing faded jeans and a gray Henley that fit him in a way that made my mouth go dry, and his hair was still messy from sleep. "Morning," he said without turning around, like he'd sensed my presence. "Morning." My voice came out rougher than I'd intended, thick with sleep. "You're up early." "Old habits." He turned and held out one of the mugs. "Coffee?" "Thanks." Our fingers brushed when I took the mug, just the barest contact, but it sent electricity shooting up my arm. If Marcus noticed, he didn't show it. "Danny still unconscious?" "Completely. He's never been a morning person." Marcus's mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. Some things don't change. We stood there in the kitchen, drinking our coffee in comfortable silence. The morning light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and I found myself studying the way it played across Marcus's face, highlighting the strong line of his cheekbones, catching the bronze in his dark eyes. "So," he said after a while, "ready to get your hands dirty?" It took me a moment to remember what he was talking about. The boat motor. Right. "Whenever you are." "Good. Let me grab some tools." 20 minutes later, we were down at the dock. The small sailboat pulled halfway onto the shore between us. The sunfish was maybe 12 feet long, white fiberglass with a blue stripe, and it had clearly seen better days. The outboard motor looked like it hadn't run in years. "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, crouching down next to the motor housing. "Won't start. Dad thinks it's just old gas, but I'm betting it's more than that." Marcus knelt beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "When I try to turn it over, nothing happens, not even a click." I leaned in to get a better look at the motor, trying to ignore the way Marcus's proximity was affecting my ability to think clearly. "Could be the starter, but let's check the basics first. When's the last time anyone looked at this thing?" "Honestly, probably not since before I left." "So, 3 years?" "At least." I whistled low. "Yeah, it's going to be more than just bad gas." We worked in comfortable silence for the first hour, pulling off the motor housing and laying out parts on an old tarp Marcus had brought down from the garage. I found myself falling into the familiar rhythm of mechanical work, the careful attention to detail, the satisfaction of diagnosing problems and finding solutions. It helped that I actually did know what I was doing, despite my protest to the contrary. My dad had been a mechanic before he'd gone back to school for accounting, and he'd spent countless Saturday mornings teaching me the basics in our garage back home. There was something peaceful about working with my hands, about the way complex problems could be broken down into manageable pieces. "Spark plug's shot," I said, holding up the corroded piece of metal. "And this fuel line is completely gummed up." Marcus leaned over to see what I was looking at, his shoulder brushing against mine. "Fixable?" "Definitely. We'll need to make a run into town for parts, but it's nothing major." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, studying the disassembled motor. "I wasn't sure you really wanted to help with this." I looked up at him, surprised. "Why wouldn't I?" "Danny volunteers you for a lot of things. Figured you might just be being polite." There was something almost vulnerable in the way he said it, like he was genuinely concerned about imposing on me. It made something soft and warm unfurl in my chest. "I like working on engines," I said honestly. "It's meditative, I guess. Everything else in my life feels complicated right now, but this is just problem solving. Find what's broken, fix it." Marcus was looking at me with that intense gaze again, like he was trying to read something in my expression. "What's complicated?" The question caught me off guard. I'd meant it as a throwaway comment, the kind of general statement about post-college life that everyone seemed to make. But there was something in Marcus's tone that made it feel like he actually wanted to know. "I don't know," I said, sitting back on my heels. Everything, I guess. What I'm supposed to do with my life, where I'm supposed to go from here. I spent 4 years working toward graduation, and now that it's done, I have no idea what comes next. That's normal. Is it? I laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it, because everyone else seems to have it figured out. Danny's got his internship lined up, most of my friends are starting jobs or grad school, and I'm just floating. Marcus was quiet for a moment, cleaning grease off his hands with a rag. You know what I learned in the military? I shook my head. Plans are overrated. You can spend months preparing for a mission, mapping out every detail, accounting for every variable, and then you get there and everything goes to shit in the first 5 minutes. He looked out at the water, his expression thoughtful. The guys who did best weren't the ones with the perfect plans. They were the ones who could adapt, who could figure things out as they went. So you're saying I should just wing it? I'm saying maybe not knowing what comes next isn't the worst thing in the world. Maybe it means you're open to possibilities you haven't thought of yet. There was something about the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about career choices. I wanted to ask him what possibilities he was thinking about, what he'd discovered when his own plans had fallen apart. But before I could work up the courage, Danny's voice cut through the morning quiet. There you guys are. I should have known I'd find you covered in motor oil. I looked down at myself, surprised to see that I was, in fact, liberally smudged with grease. Marcus had a streak across his left cheek that I hadn't noticed before. Sleep well? Marcus asked his brother, and there was definite amusement in his voice. Like the dead. What time did you guys get up? Dawn patrol, I said, wiping my hands on the rag Marcus passed me. Your brother's an early riser. Military training, Danny said knowingly. Mom says he's been getting up at 5 a.m. since he got back. Drives her crazy. Marcus shrugged, but I caught something that might have been discomfort in his expression, like he didn't want to talk about his habits or maybe about the reasons behind them. We need to make a run into town, I said, changing the subject. Need some parts to get this thing running again. Cool, I'll drive. Danny was already pulling keys out of his pocket. There's a marine supply place on Main Street, right? Henderson's, Marcus confirmed. If they don't have what we need, there's a Napa Auto Parts about 10 minutes further out. Perfect. Let me grab a shower and we can head out. Danny jogged back toward the house, leaving Marcus and me alone again. We started putting tools away, working with the easy coordination we'd developed over the morning. There was something comfortable about it, like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. Thanks, Marcus said as we folded up the tarp, for helping with this, and for not making me feel like an idiot when I couldn't figure out what was wrong. You're not an idiot, and honestly, this is the most relaxed I've felt in months. Yeah? He looked genuinely surprised. Even covered in grease and sweating your ass off. I laughed. Especially then. We were standing close again, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to count the faint freckles scattered across his nose. For a moment, neither of us moved, and I felt that same electric tension from the night before, like the air between us was charged with possibility. Then Danny's voice echoed from the house, something about not being able to find his good shoes, and the moment broke. We should probably... Marcus gestured toward the house. Yeah. But as we walked back up the dock together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Something subtle but significant, like a door that had been cracked open just enough to let in light. Henderson's Marine Supply turned out to be exactly the kind of place I'd expected to find in a small lake town. Cluttered, dimly lit, and run by a man who looked like he'd been selling boat parts since the Mesozoic era. Danny had elected to wait in the car, claiming he'd just get in the way, which left Marcus and me wandering the narrow aisles together, looking for spark plugs and fuel line. You boys working on something specific? The owner asked when we approached the counter with our findings. Old sunfish with a temperamental outboard, Marcus replied. Haven't been able to get her running in a couple years. Ah, those old Johnsons can be tricky. What year are we talking about? Marcus looked at me, and I realized he was deferring to my judgment. It was a small thing, but it made something warm spread through my chest. Early 2000s, I think. The fuel system's pretty gummed up, probably needs a complete flush. The old man nodded knowingly. You'll want some carburetor cleaner for that, and if you really want to do it right, replace the fuel filter while you're at it. 20 minutes later, we emerged into the bright afternoon sunlight with a bag full of parts and supplies. Danny was slouched in the driver's seat with his sunglasses on, looking like he might have dozed off. Get everything you need? He asked as we climbed back into the car. More than we need, probably, I said, but better to be thorough. That's what I like to hear. Where to next? Marcus consulted a list he'd pulled from his pocket. Grocery store. We're going to need more food if we're actually going to be here all weekend. And beer, Danny added. Can't forget the beer. The grocery store was a small IGA on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, and the checkout line moved at the pace of friendly conversation. We split up to divide and conquer, Danny taking care of snacks and beverages while Marcus and I handled actual food. What do you like to eat? Marcus asked as we stood in front of the meat counter. It was such a simple question, but coming from him it felt weighted with significance, like he actually cared about the answer, like my preferences mattered to him. I'm not picky, I said, but I make a pretty decent stir-fry if you've got a wok. Mom's got every kitchen gadget ever invented. Stir-fry sounds good. We moved through the store methodically, Marcus asking my opinion on vegetables and sauces, me trying not to read too much into the way he seemed genuinely interested in my answers. There was something domestic about it that made my chest tight with longing for something I couldn't quite name. You know, Marcus said as we waited in the checkout line, I can't remember the last time I went grocery shopping with someone who actually cared about what we were buying. What do you mean? Military food service is functional, and since I've been back, I've mostly just been grabbing whatever's convenient. He shrugged. It's nice to actually think about what you want to eat. There was something almost wistful in his voice that made me want to ask more questions about what he'd been eating, where he'd been living, what his life had been like since he'd come home. But Danny chose that moment to reappear with his arms full of chips and beer, and the opportunity slipped away. The drive back to the lake house was quiet, all of us lost in our own thoughts as the small town gave way to winding country roads and dense forest. I found myself watching the landscape roll by and thinking about what Marcus had said about plans being overrated, about being open to possibilities you hadn't thought of yet. What possibilities was I missing by trying so hard to figure everything out in advance? Back at the house, we spent the afternoon working on the boat motor. With the right parts and Marcus's patient assistance, the repair work went smoothly. There was something satisfying about the methodical process. Cleaning out old fuel lines, replacing corroded components, slowly bringing the engine back to life. Try it now, I said, wiping my hands on a rag. Marcus pulled the starter cord and the motor coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a healthy rumble that echoed across the water. Holy shit, Danny said from where he'd been watching from the dock. You actually did it. We did it, I corrected, but I couldn't keep the grin off my face. There was something deeply satisfying about taking something broken and making it work again. Marcus was smiling too, the first real unguarded smile I'd seen from him since he'd arrived. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, less burdened. Thanks, he said, and his hand landed on my shoulder, warm and solid. Couldn't have done it without you. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds, but I felt it for long after he'd pulled away. The weight of his palm, the casual intimacy of the gesture, the way it made my skin feel hypersensitive everywhere he'd touched. We should take her out, Danny said, already untying the boat from its mooring. Test drive the repairs. Good idea, Marcus agreed. Ethan, you want to come? I hesitated. The sunfish was small, meant for maybe 2 people comfortably. 3 would be crowded. I should probably clean up, I said, gesturing to my grease-stained clothes. Come on, Danny wheedled. Live a little. When's the next time you're going to be on a lake this beautiful? Marcus was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Up to you. Something in his tone made me think he actually wanted me to come, that this wasn't just Danny being polite. And despite the logical part of my brain that was pointing out all the reasons why sitting in a small boat with Marcus Chen Williams was a bad idea, I found myself nodding. Okay, but if this thing sinks, I'm blaming both of you. 20 minutes later, we were gliding across the lake, the rebuilt motor purring contentedly behind us. Danny had claimed the tiller, leaving Marcus and me to sit on opposite sides of the small cockpit. It should have been awkward. Our knees were practically touching, and every time one of us shifted position, the boat rocked slightly, sending us sliding toward each other. But it wasn't awkward. It was something else entirely. God, I forgot how peaceful this is, I said, trailing my fingers in the water as we cut across the lake. Different from the city, Marcus agreed. Different from everything. I leaned back against the side of the boat, letting the afternoon sun warm my face. Sometimes I think I could just disappear out here, leave all the complicated stuff behind and just exist. You ever think about doing it? Just disappearing? There was something in his voice that made me open my eyes and look at him. He was watching me with that intense gaze again, like my answer actually mattered to him. Sometimes, I said honestly. You? Every day. The simple honesty in his response made something tighten in my chest. I wanted to ask him what he was running from, what he wanted to disappear from, but Danny chose that moment to change course, sending both Marcus and me sliding toward the center of the boat. Our shoulders collided, solid and warm, and for a moment we were pressed together, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with lake water and afternoon sun. Neither of us moved away immediately, and I felt something electric pass between us. A recognition maybe, or an acknowledgement of something that had been building all day. Sorry, Marcus said quietly, but he didn't sound sorry at all. It's okay, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Danny, oblivious to the tension crackling between his brother and his best friend, was pointing out landmarks on the shoreline, talking about summers spent exploring every cove and inlet. But I was only half listening. The rest of my attention was focused on the warmth radiating from Marcus's body, on the way his dark eyes kept finding mine across the small space of the boat. When we finally made it back to shore, the sun was beginning its descent toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the still water like scattered fire. We pulled the boat up onto the beach and secured it for the night, working together with the easy coordination we'd developed over the course of the day. I'm going to grab a shower before dinner, Danny announced, already heading toward the house. That stir-fry isn't going to make itself. I'll start prepping the vegetables, I called after him. I'll help, Marcus said, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. There was an intensity in his expression that hadn't been there before, like he was working up the courage to say something important. But then Danny was calling something about finding clean towels, and the moment passed. Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair. I'd been worried that the day's accumulated tension might make things awkward, but instead the three of us fell into an easy rhythm in the kitchen. Danny handled the rice while I worked on the stir-fry, and Marcus set the table and opened a bottle of wine his mother had left in the pantry. This is incredible, Danny said around a mouthful of vegetables and sauce. Seriously, Ethan, you should open a restaurant. It's just a stir-fry, I protested. But I was pleased. Cooking for people I cared about had always been one of my favorite things, and there was something particularly satisfying about seeing Marcus's obvious enjoyment of the meal. Don't let him downplay it, Marcus said, meeting my eyes across the table. This is really good. The simple compliment made warmth spread through my chest, and I had to look away before I did something stupid like smile too widely or say something revealing. After dinner, we migrated to the living room where Danny immediately claimed the couch and started flipping through streaming services on the ancient television. What do you guys want to watch? I'm thinking something mindless and entertaining. You pick, I said, settling into one of the armchairs. Marcus took the other chair, positioning himself so that he had a clear view of both the TV and me. Danny eventually settled on some action movie from the early 2000s, the kind of thing that was perfect for background noise. But I found it hard to focus on the explosions and one-liners when I was so acutely aware of Marcus's presence just a few feet away. Every time he shifted in his chair or reached for his beer, I felt hyper-aware of the movement. About halfway through the movie, Danny's breathing began to even out. True to Marcus's prediction, he'd fallen asleep on the couch, his head pillowed on his arm and his face relaxed in a way that made him look years younger. "Should we wake him up?" I whispered. Marcus shook his head. "He'll be more comfortable there than trying to make it upstairs. He always was a heavy sleeper." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the movie playing out its predictable plot on the screen in front of us. But I was barely watching. Instead, I found myself stealing glances at Marcus, studying the way the flickering light from the television played across his features. "I should probably turn in," I said eventually, though I made no move to get up. "Probably," Marcus agreed, but he didn't move either. The movie ended, credits rolling over freeze frames of explosions and triumphant heroes. The room fell into darkness except for the soft glow from the television screen, and suddenly the silence felt charged with possibility. "Ethan," Marcus said quietly. "Yeah? Thanks. For today, I mean, it's been a good day." There was something in his voice that made me think he meant more than just the boat repair and the meal. Like maybe he was thanking me for something larger, something he couldn't quite put into words. "For me too," I said. We looked at each other across the darkened room, and I felt that same electric tension from earlier, stronger now in the intimate quiet of the sleeping house. For a moment, I thought he might say something else, might give voice to the thing that had been building between us all day. Instead, he stood up, careful not to make any noise that might wake Danny. "Good night, Ethan," he said softly. "Good night." I watched him disappear up the stairs, then sat alone in the dark living room for a long time, listening to Danny's quiet breathing and trying to make sense of the restless energy coursing through my veins. The next day dawned gray and overcast, with low clouds hanging over the lake like a soft blanket. I woke to the sound of rain pattering against the windows and Danny groaning about the weather ruining our plans for a day on the water. "It's just a little rain," I said, peering out at the lake. The surface was dimpled with raindrops, creating an ever-shifting pattern of circles that spread and overlapped and disappeared. "A little rain?" Danny gestured dramatically at the window. "It looks like the apocalypse out there." "It's supposed to clear up this afternoon," Marcus said from the doorway. He was fully dressed despite the early hour, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Weather service says it'll be sunny by 3. "How do you know what the weather service says?" Danny asked. "I thought there was no internet here." "Radio in the kitchen. Dad always keeps it tuned to the local station." Danny brightened. "Okay, so maybe the day isn't completely ruined. What do we do until then?" "Board games," I suggested. "I saw a whole closet full downstairs." "Perfect. I call dibs on being the banker in Monopoly." "Absolutely not," Marcus said with the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him. "You always cheat at Monopoly." "I do not cheat. I just have a more creative interpretation of the rules." "See? Cheating." Watching them banter was like getting a glimpse of who they'd been before Marcus left, when their relationship was uncomplicated by time and distance and whatever Marcus had experienced overseas. There was an ease between them that I envied, a shorthand built on years of shared history. We spent the morning in the living room playing increasingly competitive games of Scrabble and gin rummy while the rain drummed steadily against the windows. Danny proved to be exactly as ruthless at board games as he was at everything else, but Marcus held his own with quiet strategic thinking that reminded me of the way he'd approached the boat motor: methodical, thorough, effective. "I think you're making up words," Danny accused when Marcus played quixotic for a triple word score. "It's a real word. It means idealistic but impractical." "Use it in a sentence." Marcus's eyes found mine across the game board. It would be quixotic to think that some things could ever be simple. There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't just talking about vocabulary, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks under his steady gaze. "See," Danny said, oblivious to the undercurrent. "Total made-up word. No one talks like that in real life." "Maybe you just need to expand your vocabulary," I said, grateful for the distraction. Maybe you need to mind your own business, Danny shot back, but he was grinning. By lunchtime, the rain had lightened to a gentle drizzle, and by mid-afternoon, just as Marcus had predicted, the sun was breaking through the clouds in golden shafts that turned the lake surface into a mirror of light. Beach time, Danny announced, already changing into swim trunks. Last one in the water has to clean up dinner. The water's going to be freezing, I protested. That's what makes it fun. Come on, don't be a baby. 15 minutes later, I was standing on the dock in my swim shorts, watching Danny cannonball into the lake with a whoop of joy that echoed across the water. He surfaced immediately, gasping and laughing. Holy shit, that's cold, but it's amazing. Come on, guys. I looked at Marcus, who was standing beside me in board shorts that showed off the lean muscle of his torso. There were scars I hadn't noticed before. A thin white line across his left shoulder, what looked like shrapnel marks along his ribs. Evidence of whatever he'd experienced in places I couldn't imagine. You going in? I asked. Eventually. He was looking out at the water where Danny was treading water and calling encouragement. You? I guess. Though I should probably warn you, I'm not much of a swimmer. It's not deep here, maybe 6 feet at the end of the dock. Something in his voice made me look at him more carefully. There was tension in his posture that hadn't been there before, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of discomfort. You okay? Fine, he said quickly, too quickly. But before I could ask any follow-up questions, Danny was splashing toward the dock, clearly planning to drag us both into the water by force if necessary. I took a deep breath and jumped, hitting the water with a shock of cold that drove all the air from my lungs. Marcus was right, it wasn't deep, and once the initial shock wore off, the water felt incredible against my skin, clean and soft and somehow alive in a way that chlorinated pools never managed. This is perfect, I said, floating on my back and looking up at the clearing sky. Right? Danny was doing some kind of elaborate backstroke that involved more splashing than forward motion. I forgot how good this feels. Marcus finally joined us, slipping into the water with barely a splash. He was a strong swimmer, I noticed, moving through the water with the same controlled efficiency he brought to everything else. But he stayed close to the dock, never venturing out toward the deeper parts of the lake. We spent an hour in the water, playing increasingly ridiculous games of Marco Polo and seeing who could hold their breath the longest underwater. It was the kind of carefree fun I associated with being 12 years old, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. But I was also increasingly aware of Marcus, the way the water made his dark hair curl at the nape of his neck, the way his skin looked golden in the afternoon sunlight, the careful way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. When we finally hauled ourselves out of the lake, dripping and exhausted, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Danny immediately claimed one of the loungers and sprawled out like a contented cat, but Marcus and I ended up sitting on the edge of the dock, our feet dangling in the water. That was fun, I said, wringing water out of my hair. Yeah. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the far shore. I haven't done anything like that in a long time. What, swimming? Just playing, being silly, not thinking about anything serious. He was quiet for another moment. It's easy to forget that's allowed. There was something almost wistful in his voice that made me want to ask him what he meant, what had made him forget that joy was permitted. But before I could work up the courage, Danny was sitting up and stretching. I'm starving, he announced. And someone owes me dinner since I was clearly the first one in the water. That's not how it worked, I protested. You said last one in, not first one in. Details. The point is I'm hungry and you're cooking. I looked at Marcus, who shrugged with a smile that made my stomach flutter. I'll help, he said. Dinner was leftover lasagna reheated in the oven, served with a salad that Marcus insisted on making himself. We ate on the screened porch, listening to the sound of water lapping against the dock and watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Perfect day, Danny said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. Even with the rain this morning. Especially with the rain, I said. Made the afternoon feel more special. Marcus looked at me across the table, and I caught something in his expression that made me think he understood what I meant. That anticipation made everything sweeter, that waiting for something good made it even better when it finally arrived. After we cleaned up, Danny suggested a bonfire on the beach. Perfect night for it, he said. Clear sky, no wind, and I saw a whole stack of firewood in the garage. An hour later, we had a respectable fire crackling on the small stretch of sand behind the house. Danny had dragged down camping chairs and a cooler full of beer, and we sat around the flames as darkness settled over the lake like a soft blanket. This is what I missed most about this place, Danny said, staring into the fire. Not just the lake or the house, but this. Sitting around a fire with people I care about, talking about nothing important. What do you mean, nothing important? I asked. I don't know, just normal stuff. Not grades or internships or what we're going to do with our lives, just sitting here, being here. I understood what he meant. There was something timeless about sitting around a fire, something that connected us to every generation of humans who had ever gathered around flames to share stories in silence. It made all the complicated parts of modern life feel distant and unimportant. I used to think about this when I was deployed, Marcus said quietly. Sitting around fires like this, it was one of the things that kept me going. What were the others? Danny asked. Marcus was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Coming home, being myself again, remembering who I was before. And did you remember? Marcus looked across the fire at his brother, then at me. Still working on it. There was something raw in his admission that made my chest tight with empathy. I wanted to tell him that he seemed like himself to me, that whatever he'd lost over there, he was still fundamentally the person Danny had grown up admiring. But I wasn't sure I had the right to say something so personal, so I just met his eyes across the flames and hoped he could see the understanding in my expression. We sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Danny was the first to call it a night, yawning and stretching as he stood up. I'm beat, he said. Don't stay up too late, you guys. We should probably head back tomorrow afternoon. After he disappeared into the house, Marcus and I sat alone by the dying fire. The silence between us felt different now, charged with possibility, heavy with things unsaid. The lake was completely still, a perfect mirror reflecting the stars, and the only sound was the gentle lap of water against the shore. It's beautiful out here, I said finally, needing to break the silence before it became too meaningful. Yeah. Marcus's voice was quiet, thoughtful. I'd forgotten how quiet it could be. How peaceful. Different from wherever you were deployed? Very different. He was quiet for a moment. Everything there was about noise, movement, staying alert. This is the opposite of that. I wanted to ask him more about what he'd experienced, what had changed him so fundamentally that his own brother worried about him. But there was something in his posture that warned me off, a careful control that suggested those weren't stories he was ready to tell. Can I ask you something? He said suddenly. Of course. What do you see when you look at me? The question caught me completely off guard. I turned to study his profile in the firelight, trying to understand what he was really asking. What do you mean? I mean, he was quiet for a moment, staring into the coals. Danny looks at me and sees his big brother who's supposed to have all the answers. My parents look at me and see their son who went away and came back different. Everyone else looks at me and sees a veteran, a hero, someone who served his country. He finally turned to meet my eyes. But you look at me like you're seeing something else entirely. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Maybe because I don't have any preconceptions about who you're supposed to be. Maybe. He was quiet again. Or maybe because you're not afraid of whatever you see. Should I be? I don't know. Sometimes I think I should be afraid of myself. The raw honesty in his voice made something crack open in my chest. Without really thinking about it, I reached across the space between our chairs and touched his hand where it rested on the armrest. Just a brief contact, skin against skin, but I felt him go very still. I'm not afraid of you, I said quietly. He looked down at where my hand had touched his, then back up at my face. You should be. I'm not. I'm not the same person I was before I left. None of us are the same people we were 5 years ago. That's not necessarily a bad thing, isn't it? There was something almost desperate in his voice. What if the person you've become isn't someone you recognize? What if you don't know how to be in the world anymore? I wanted to tell him that he seemed to be doing just fine, that he'd been nothing but kind and thoughtful since I'd arrived. Instead, I found myself saying something much more honest. Then maybe you figure it out as you go. Maybe you find people who see you clearly and let them help you remember who you are. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. There was something searching in his expression, like he was looking for proof that I meant what I'd said. Is that what you're doing? He asked finally. Figuring it out as you go? Trying to? And the people who see you clearly? I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I held his gaze. Still looking for them, I guess. Something shifted in his expression then, a softening that made him look younger, more vulnerable. Maybe you don't have to look as hard as you think. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to acknowledge. We sat there in the dying firelight, looking at each other across the small space between our chairs, and I felt like we were standing at the edge of something that would change everything if we stepped across it. Then Marcus spoke, his voice so quiet I almost missed it over the gentle sound of water against the shore. I don't know what this is, he said, his eyes never leaving mine, but I don't want to stop feeling it. Part 2. I didn't speak at first. I couldn't. The words hung in the air between us like something fragile and dangerous, and I was afraid that if I moved too quickly, if I said the wrong thing, the moment would shatter and disappear. Instead, I looked at him, really looked. Marcus was leaning forward slightly in his chair, his hands clasped loosely between his knees, the dying firelight casting shadows across his face that made his eyes look impossibly dark. There was vulnerability in his expression that I'd never seen before, like he'd peeled back some carefully constructed layer and was showing me something raw and true underneath. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt full, pregnant with possibility, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Finally, slowly, I leaned forward too. The space between our chairs was maybe 3 feet, but it felt like miles. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it in the quiet night air. Marcus, I whispered. Yeah? I feel it too. Something shifted in his expression then, relief maybe, or recognition, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. I stood up from my chair, the movement careful and deliberate, like I was approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Marcus watched me, his eyes tracking my every step as I closed the distance between us. When I was close enough to touch him, I stopped. We were both breathing carefully, like the air had become precious and finite. In the dim glow of the dying fire, I could see the pulse jumping in his throat, could smell his cologne mixed with lake water and wood smoke. Is this okay? I asked, my voice barely audible. Instead of answering with words, Marcus stood too, bringing us face to face. He was maybe an inch taller than me, close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to meet his eyes. Close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could count the faint freckles scattered across his nose. For a moment, we just stood there, breathing the same air, existing in the same small circle of space. Then Marcus lifted one hand slowly, tentatively, until his fingers were barely brushing against my cheek. I've never, he started, then stopped. Never what? Never wanted something I wasn't supposed to want. The words hit me like a physical blow, partly because of what they revealed about him, but mostly because they echoed something I'd been trying not to acknowledge in myself. Who says you're not supposed to want it? His thumb traced across my cheekbone, the touch so light it was barely there. Everyone, everything, the way I was raised, the military, the way the world works. Fuck the world, I said. surprised by the vehemence in my own voice. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, and then he was smiling. Not the careful, controlled expression I'd gotten used to, but something real and warm and transformative. "Fuck the world," he repeated, like he was testing how the words felt in his mouth. And then he was leaning in, slowly giving me every opportunity to pull away, to change my mind, to remember all the reasons why this was complicated and dangerous and probably a terrible idea. I didn't pull away. Our lips met in the space between heartbeats, soft and tentative and earth-shatteringly gentle. It was barely a kiss at all, more like a question, a test, a whispered promise. But it sent electricity racing through every nerve in my body, made my knees weak and my head spin and my chest tight with something that felt like coming home. Marcus pulled back after maybe 3 seconds, just far enough to search my face for regret or fear or any sign that I wanted him to stop. "Okay," he whispered. "More than okay." This time when he kissed me, there was more intention behind it, more certainty. His hand slid from my cheek to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, and I felt myself leaning into the touch like a plant turning towards sunlight. It was still gentle, still careful, but there was heat building underneath the tenderness, a slow burn that started in my chest and spread outward until my entire body felt hypersensitive and alive. I could taste him, something clean and warm and uniquely Marcus, and I wanted to memorize it, to hold on to this moment so tightly that it could never fade. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Marcus rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his thumb still tracing patterns against the sensitive skin at the nape of my neck. "I've never," he said again, then stopped. "Never kissed a guy? Never kissed anyone and felt like this." The honesty in his voice made my chest tight with emotion. Like what? Like I could just disappear into it, like nothing else matters. I understood exactly what he meant. The rest of the world had faded away the moment his lips touched mine. The dying fire, the dark lake, the knowledge that Danny was sleeping just 100 yards away in the house behind us. There was only this. Marcus's hand in my hair, his breath warm against my skin, the impossible rightness of finally acknowledging what had been building between us since the moment he'd walked into that kitchen. "We should," Marcus started, then trailed off. "Should what?" "Be careful. Danny's right there, and if anyone saw us—" He was right, of course. We were standing on an open beach, visible from the house and the road and probably half the other properties around the lake. Anyone could walk by, could see us, could recognize Danny's older brother and his best friend, and draw their own conclusions. But I didn't want to be careful. I wanted to stay right here in this moment, in this bubble of possibility that felt more real than anything I'd experienced in months. "There's a hammock," Marcus said quietly, "on the other side of the dock, more private." It wasn't really a question, but I nodded anyway. We walked toward the water together, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the electricity arcing between us with every step. The hammock was strung between two tall pines at the edge of the property, invisible from the house but with a perfect view of the star-filled sky above the lake. Marcus settled into the hammock first, then held out his hand to help me climb in beside him. It was awkward for a moment. Hammocks weren't really designed for two people, but we managed to arrange ourselves side by side, our shoulders pressed together, both of us looking up at the canopy of stars overhead. "Better?" he asked. "Better." We lay there in silence for a while, the hammock swaying gently in the soft night breeze. I was acutely aware of every point where our bodies touched, his shoulder against mine, his thigh pressed along the length of my leg, his hand resting just inches from mine on the fabric between us. "Tell me something true," Marcus said suddenly. "Like what?" "Anything. Something you've never told anyone else." I thought for a moment, trying to decide how honest I was willing to be. "I used to have dreams about you," I said finally. I felt him go very still beside me. "What kind of dreams?" "The kind where I'd wake up feeling guilty and confused and like I was losing my mind." I took a shaky breath. "It started in high school, after I saw you at Danny's graduation. I told myself it was just because you looked so different in your uniform, so adult and confident and, I don't know, unattainable, I guess. Unattainable how? You were this person who existed in Danny's stories, who showed up for holidays and special occasions and then disappeared again. You were real, but not real in my world. And you were... I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. I was what? Everything I thought I wasn't supposed to want. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I used to think about you too. My heart stopped. You did? That graduation day, you were sitting in the third row wearing this blue button-down shirt that made your eyes look incredible, and you kept pushing your hair back when you got nervous. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. I was 17. I know, that's why I felt like such a creep for noticing. But I couldn't stop looking at you, and when our eyes met during the ceremony, I felt like I'd been hit by lightning. I turned my head to look at him, surprised by the raw honesty in his voice. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? Hey, Danny, I think I'm attracted to your underage best friend. That would have gone over well. I wasn't underage. I turned 18 3 weeks before graduation. Marcus turned to face me too, and suddenly we were lying on our sides, inches apart, our faces so close I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Would it have mattered? He asked. What do you mean? If I had said something, if I'd told you how I felt, would it have changed anything? I thought about it, about who I'd been at 18, about the carefully constructed walls I'd built around my sexuality, about the terror and excitement and confusion that had defined those years. I don't know, I said honestly. I was so scared of what I was feeling, so convinced that there was something wrong with me for wanting what I wanted. If you'd said something, you might have run. Or I might have kissed you in front of 300 people at your brother's graduation ceremony. Marcus smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. That would have been a hell of a coming out story. Danny would have killed us both. Probably. His expression grew more serious. He still might. The reminder of reality was like cold water washing away some of the magical intimacy of the moment. Danny was my best friend, had been since we were kids. He was also Marcus's little brother, protective and possessive in the way that younger siblings often are. How would he react if he knew what was happening between us? Are you worried about that? I asked. Terrified, Marcus admitted. Danny's the most important person in my life. I can't lose him. You won't lose him. How can you be so sure? I reached out slowly and touched his hand where it rested between us. His fingers were warm and slightly rough, and when I traced my thumb across his knuckles, I felt him shiver. Because he loves you, I said simply. And because this, whatever this is, it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't make you less his brother. Doesn't it? Does it feel like it does? Marcus was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching my face in the starlight. No, he said finally. It feels like I'm more myself than I've been in years. Then trust that. He turned his hand over, palm up, and let me lace our fingers together. It was such a simple gesture, but it sent warmth racing up my arm and settling in my chest like a small sun. I've never done this before, he said quietly. What, held hands? Any of it. Been with a guy, felt like this about someone, wanted something so much it scared me. He squeezed my fingers gently. I don't know what I'm doing. Me neither, I admitted. Not like this. Not like what? I struggled to find the words for what I was feeling. I've been with guys before, but it was always, I don't know, physical, simple. This is complicated. Terrifying, I corrected. It felt impossible, and yet with you it felt like breathing. Marcus's free hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing across my lower lip with infinite gentleness. Can I kiss you again? He asked. Instead of answering, I closed the distance between us, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was deeper than before, more certain. His hand tightened in mine, and I felt him sigh against my mouth, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. and could finally exhale. We kissed like that for what felt like hours, slow and exploratory and achingly tender. There was no urgency to it, no desperate rush towards something more. It was enough just to be here, just to taste him and touch him and feel the solid warmth of his body pressed against mine. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Marcus rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his fingers still tangled with mine. "What happens after the weekend?" he asked quietly. The question I'd been trying not to think about. In less than 18 hours, Danny and I would be driving back to the city, back to our separate lives and complicated futures. Marcus would stay here or go back to his apartment in town, and this, whatever this was, would become just a memory. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Long distance is hard." "Is that what you want, to try long distance?" Marcus opened his eyes, meeting my gaze with an intensity that made my chest tight. "I want to try everything. I want to figure out what this is, where it goes, what it means, but I also want to be realistic about the obstacles." "Like what?" "Like the fact that you live 3 hours away, like the fact that I'm still figuring out who I am after the deployment, like the fact that this is all new to me and I have no idea how to do it right." I understood his concerns. They were the same ones that had been gnawing at me since the moment he'd first kissed me. But lying here with him, feeling the rightness of his hand in mine, the obstacles seemed manageable. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," I said. "We just have to decide if it's worth trying." "Is it worth trying?" I looked at him, really looked, at the way the starlight caught in his dark hair, at the vulnerable expression in his eyes, at the careful way he held himself even in this moment of intimacy. I thought about the way he'd made me feel over the past 2 days, seen, understood, valued for who I was rather than who I was supposed to be. "I'll remember this," I said instead of answering directly. "No matter what happens after we leave here, I'll remember the way you looked at me tonight, the way you made me feel like I was worth something." Marcus's eyes grew bright with emotion. "You are worth something. You're worth everything." And then he was kissing me again, deeper this time, with a desperation that spoke of borrowed time and uncertain futures. I kissed him back with everything I had, pouring all my confusion and hope and terrifying affection into the connection between us. We might have stayed like that all night, lost in each other and the magic of this impossible moment, if not for the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch above us. We both froze. Marcus's idea